Arthur Pendleton did not look like a man who handled his own dirty work, but he had a specific, practiced swagger when he stood on a porch. He was 54, wore a tailored gray suit that always seemed a bit too tight around the middle, and carried himself with the absolute certainty of a man who owned 4 city blocks and 3 suburban strip malls. To Arthur, the world was divided into 2 distinct categories: things he owned and people who owed him money. I stood on the other side of the screen door, my left hand resting on the leather harness of Scout, my golden retriever. Scout was perfectly still, his chin brushing against my knee, his eyes fixed entirely on me. He wasn't barking. He wasn't moving. He was doing exactly what he had been trained to do since he was a puppy, keeping me grounded while my heart rhythm decided to act like a runaway train. Arthur didn't look at Scout. He didn't look at me either. Instead, he looked at the clipboard in his hand, tapped it with a heavy gold signet ring, and slid a folded white piece of paper through the gap in the door frame. 24 hours, Maya, Arthur said. His voice was flat, devoid of any real malice, which somehow made it worse. It was the voice of a bureaucrat filing a routine insurance claim. You, the dog, and your things, gone by noon tomorrow. My throat felt like it was coated in sand. I had lived in apartment 4B for 3 years. I had paid my rent 5 days early every single month. I had never received a noise complaint, never broken a rule, and even helped the elderly woman in 4C carry her groceries up the stairs when the elevator broke down last winter. Arthur, he's a service animal, I said, trying to keep my voice from cracking. I showed you the medical documentation before I signed the lease renewal last month. You approved it. The Fair Housing Act. The lease says no pets, Arthur interrupted, finally raising his eyes to meet mine. They were small, pale blue, and entirely cold. I allowed it because I thought he was a small thing, a companion, but a full-grown retriever. He's tracking dirt into the carpeted hallways. The tenant in 4A says he can hear him pacing at night. I run a premium building, Maya, not a kennel. You broke the lease agreement by bringing a large animal into a restricted unit. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises before I call the sheriff's department to remove your property. He doesn't pace, Arthur. He sleeps by my bed, and he's a medical necessity, I whispered. My vision was starting to blur at the edges, a familiar, terrifying sensation that meant my blood pressure was dropping fast. Scout felt the shift instantly. He leaned his 50-pound body heavily against my shins, applying the precise amount of deep pressure stimulation needed to keep me from fainting. Arthur looked down at the dog then, a brief flicker of disgust crossing his face. Medical necessity or not, I own the brick, the mortar, and the air you're breathing inside this apartment. The notice is legal. The sheriff will be here at 12:01 p.m. tomorrow. I suggest you start packing. He turned on his heel and walked down the carpeted hallway, his expensive leather shoes making a soft, rhythmic thud against the floorboards. I closed the heavy oak door, turned my back against it, and slid down until I was sitting on the floor. Scout immediately crawled into my lap, resting his heavy head against my chest, his tail giving 2 slow, reassuring thumps against the hardwood. I buried my face in his soft fur and let the panic take over. 24 hours. In a city where the housing market was a bloodbath and average rent required 2 separate cosigners, finding an apartment took months. Finding one that accepted a service animal, even legally, without an uphill battle was even harder. I had $300 in my savings account, a freelance graphic design business that was barely keeping me fed, and no family within 500 miles. By 9:00 p.m., my living room looked like a war zone. Cardboard boxes I'd begged from the grocery store down the street were piled high, half filled with books, kitchen utensils, and winter clothes. My hands were raw from packing tape, and my mind was spinning. I knew the law. I had spent hours researching it when I first got Scout. Landlords couldn't just throw you out for having a legitimate service animal. The Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act were supposed to protect people like me. But Arthur Pendleton didn't care about the law because he assumed I couldn't afford to enforce it. He knew exactly how much money I made. He checked my bank statements during the application process. He knew I didn't have a $5,000 retainer fee for a real estate lawyer. At midnight, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text from Clara, my closest friend from college, who had moved to Chicago 2 years ago to work for a high-profile corporate litigation firm. "Hey, just checking in. How's the new design project going?" I stared at the screen for a long time before typing back. "Arthur is evicting me, giving me 24 hours because of Scout. I'm packing right now. I don't know where to go." 3 seconds later, the phone rang. "Explain," Clara said, skipping any greeting. Her voice had changed over the last 2 years. The soft, hesitant girl I used to share a dorm room with was gone. In her place was a woman who spoke in sharp, clipped sentences that sounded like they belonged in a courtroom. I told her everything. I told her about the notice, the comments about the carpet, the threat of the sheriff, and the absolute certainty in Arthur's voice. As I spoke, I could hear the rapid clicking of a keyboard on her end of the line. "He gave you a written 24-hour notice based explicitly on the presence of a service animal?" Clara asked, her tone shifting from friendly concern to something much colder, much more calculated. "Yes, it's sitting on my kitchen counter right now. It literally says, 'Violation of no pet policy,' large canine at the top." The clicking stopped. A long silence stretched over the line. "Maya," Clara said softly, and for the first time in months, I heard a hint of a smile in her voice. "Do you remember my firm's managing partner? The one I told you about last month, the one who specializes in federal civil rights and housing discrimination?" "Mr. Vance." "David Vance," Clara corrected. "He hates bullies. More importantly, he hates wealthy landlords who think federal statutes are optional suggestions. Send me a clear photo of that notice right now. Don't pack another box. Go to sleep." "Clara, the sheriff is coming tomorrow noon." "The sheriff isn't doing anything tomorrow, Maya. Send the photo. Let me work." I did what she said. I took a picture of the crinkled white paper, sent it, and then lay down on the mattress I had already stripped of its sheets. Scout curled into the small of my back. For the first time all day, my heart rate stayed steady. The next morning arrived with a brutal, blinding sun. By 11:30 a.m., I was standing in the lobby of the building. I hadn't moved my furniture out because I literally had nowhere to put it. I just had 2 suitcases, Scout's food bin, and his favorite chew toy packed into a canvas bag. At 11:45 a.m., the heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open. Arthur Pendleton walked in, holding a large paper cup of steaming coffee from the expensive bakery across the street. Beside him was a deputy sheriff in a brown uniform, looking thoroughly bored and holding a clipboard. Arthur spotted me sitting on the bench by the elevators. He checked his gold watch, then looked at me with a smirk that made my stomach turn. "Well, Maya, I see you're packed," Arthur said, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "Where's the moving truck? Or are you planning on carrying that sofa down the block on your back?" The deputy didn't say anything. He just shifted his weight, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Before I could answer, the glass lobby doors swung open again. This time, 3 people walked in. Clara was in the lead, wearing a sharp navy blue pantsuit, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. To her left was a tall, silver-haired man in a bespoke charcoal 3-piece suit. He carried a heavy leather briefcase and had the posture of a man who owned whatever room he happened to walk into. To Clara's right was a younger man carrying a digital video camera, which was already raised to his eye, the red recording light glowing steadily. Arthur blinked, lowering his coffee cup slightly. "Can I help you people? This is private property." The silver-haired man didn't look at Arthur. He looked at me, gave a polite, reassuring nod, and then turned his attention to the landlord. "Mr. Pendleton?" the man asked. His voice was a rich, deep baritone that echoed off the marble tiles of the lobby. "Who's asking?" Arthur replied, his defensive wall instantly going up. "My name is David Vance, of Vance, Sterling and Associates," the man said, stepping forward. He didn't offer his hand. Instead, he opened his briefcase with 2 sharp clicks of the brass latches. "We represent Maya Lynn." Arthur let out a short, harsh laugh. She got a lawyer. Look, pal, I don't care who you are. She violated the lease. No dogs. The notice was served yesterday. The 24 hours are up. Deputy, do your job. The deputy looked at David Vance, then looked at the law firm logo engraved on the leather briefcase. The deputy's expression changed instantly from bored to deeply uncomfortable. He took a half step back. Mr. Pendleton, Vance said, his voice remaining terrifyingly calm. You are currently in the process of executing an illegal eviction in direct violation of Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Federal Fair Housing Act. Not only did you knowingly evict a tenant for utilizing a certified medical service animal, but you also attempted to do so on a 24-hour notice without a court-ordered warrant of eviction. I own the building, Arthur snapped, his face turning a blotchy red. I can evict whoever I want if they break my rules. You own the building, yes, Vance said, pulling a thick stack of stapled documents from his briefcase. But you do not own the United States federal court system. Less than 1 hour ago, our firm filed a formal civil action against you and Pendleton Residential Holdings in the United States District Court. Vance stepped forward, extending the papers toward Arthur. We are suing you for intentional discrimination, breach of contract, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and statutory violations of the FHA. Because your actions were carried out with deliberate malice and reckless indifference to my client's federally protected rights, we are seeking treble damages. Arthur didn't take the papers. He just stared at them, his mouth slightly open. Treble, what the hell does that mean? It means triple, Mr. Pendleton, Clara chimed in, her voice cutting through the lobby air like a scalpel. 3 times the total value of the lease, 3 times the emotional distress valuation, and 3 times our legal fees. We are currently valuing this suit at $450,000. Arthur's hand began to tremble. The paper coffee cup he was holding slipped from his fingers. It hit the polished marble floor with a loud, wet thud, splashing hot brown liquid and white plastic foam all over the tops of his expensive leather shoes and the cuffs of his gray trousers. He didn't even look down at it. His eyes were glued to the federal court stamp at the top of the paperwork David Vance was holding right in front of his face. Arthur didn't move. The dark brown puddle of coffee expanded across the white marble tile, creeping outward until it touched the toe of the deputy sheriff's boot. The deputy looked down, lifted his foot with a disgusted grimace, and quietly took another 2 steps back toward the glass exit doors. He looked at Arthur, then at the camera still rolling in the hands of David Vance's assistant, and finally at the thick legal stack Vance was holding out. Arthur, the deputy muttered, his voice low and warning, take the papers. Arthur's jaw worked silently for a few seconds before he finally reached out. His fingers twitched as they gripped the edge of the document. He pulled it toward himself, his eyes scanning the first page, skipping past the formal legal jargon until they locked onto the bold text. United States District Court. Below that, his own name and the name of his holding company were printed in stark, unyielding black ink. This is a joke, Arthur whispered, though the sudden lack of volume in his voice suggested he knew it wasn't. He looked up, trying to find his swagger again, but his eyes were darting rapidly between Vance, Clara, and the lens of the camera. You think you can scare me out of my own property? I have lawyers too, Vance. The best firm in the city handles my real estate assets. I am well aware of who represents you, Mr. Pendleton, Vance replied, closing his briefcase with a single, sharp click that sounded like a starter pistol in the quiet lobby. And I welcome their call. In fact, I've already sent a courtesy copy of this filing to their managing partner's personal inbox. I imagine his phone is ringing right about now. As if on cue, a muffled, rhythmic buzzing vibrated from inside Arthur's tight suit jacket. He froze. He didn't reach for his pocket. He just stood there, the hot coffee soaking completely through his socks, his phone continuing to vibrate against his chest like an angry insect. You have exactly 2 options today, Vance continued, stepping closer so that he completely dominated Arthur's field of vision. Option 1, You proceed with this eviction. You instruct this deputy to remove Miss Lynn's belongings. If you choose that route, my assistant here will continue recording this blatant violation of federal law. We will add a claim for punitive damages by the end of the business day, and I will personally ensure this video is distributed to every local news outlet before the 5 o'clock broadcast. A wealthy landlord throwing a disabled young woman and her service animal onto the street makes for excellent television. Arthur's face went from blotchy red to a dull, ashen gray. The buzzing in his pocket finally stopped, only to start again 2 seconds later. Option 2, Vance said, his voice dropping into a tone that was almost conversational, yet infinitely more dangerous. You instruct the deputy that there has been an administrative misunderstanding. You apologize to Miss Lynn. You leave her apartment exactly as it is, and you return to your office to discuss with your counsel just how many zeros you are going to have to write on a settlement check to keep this case out of a federal courtroom. What is your choice, Mr. Pendleton? Arthur looked at the deputy. The deputy shrugged, crossed his arms, and shook his head. I'm not touching anything in that apartment without a signed judge's order, Arthur. Not with a federal lawsuit sitting on the table. I'm leaving. The deputy didn't wait for a response. He turned, pushed open the glass doors, and walked out into the bright afternoon sun, leaving the heavy doors to swing shut behind him with a soft sigh. Arthur stood alone in the center of his own lobby, looking smaller than he had 10 minutes ago. He finally pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen showed 3 missed calls from his primary corporate attorney. He didn't answer the current incoming call. He simply swiped it silent and shoved the phone back into his pocket. He looked at me for the first time since he had entered the lobby. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a tense, simmering resentment. You think you're clever, don't you? You think this makes you safe here. Mr. Pendleton, Clara interrupted, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. Scout gave a small, alert huff, his tail remaining perfectly still. Any communication directed toward my client will go through our office. If you say one more word to her, we will add a harassment claim to the filing before the ink on this notice is even dry. Arthur swallowed hard. He looked down at his ruined shoes, then back at the legal papers in his hand. Without another word, he turned around and walked toward the building's back exit, his wet shoes making a squelching sound with every step he took. The moment the exit door clicked shut behind him, the tension in the lobby dissolved. The young man with the camera lowered the device and hit the stop button. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since yesterday afternoon. My knees felt weak, and I leaned heavily against the wooden bench. Scout immediately turned, pressing his flank against my legs to keep me steady, his dark eyes looking up at me with absolute focus. Are you okay, Maya? Clara asked, rushing over to put a hand on my shoulder. I'm alive, I said, a faint, breathless laugh escaping my throat. My heart is pounding, but I'm alive. Clara, thank you, I don't even know what to say. Don't thank me yet, Clara smiled, though her eyes were glowing with the thrill of the victory. Thank Mr. Vance. He's the one who authorized the emergency, filing at 7 this morning. I looked up at David Vance. The silver-haired lawyer was busy adjusting the cuffs of his suit jacket, looking entirely unbothered by the high-stakes drama that had just unfolded. He looked down at me, his expression softening into a warm, professional smile. You don't need to thank me, Miss Lynn, Vance said. People like Arthur Pendleton rely on the assumption that their tenants are too tired, too poor, or too scared to fight back. They build their empires on the silence of people they think they can bully. It is a genuine pleasure to remind them that the law applies to everyone, regardless of how many square feet they own. So, what happens now? I asked, looking at the 2 suitcases sitting by the elevator. Do I stay here? Can he just try this again next month? He won't try anything next month, Vance said confidently. He's an arrogant man, but he isn't stupid. His lawyers are going to read that complaint, look at the evidence of the 24-hour notice he signed with his own hand, and they are going to tell him that going to trial would be financial suicide for his holding company. They will ask for a settlement negotiation within 48 hours. And the apartment. You go back upstairs, you unpack your things, and you live your life, Vance said, picking up his briefcase. You are protected by a federal injunction the moment that lawsuit was filed. If a single light bulb burns out in your unit and he takes more than 24 hours to fix it, we will claim retaliation. You are, for all intents and purposes, the most untouchable tenant in this city right now. He extended his hand this time, and I shook it, my fingers still trembling slightly. He reached down and gave Scout a brief, respectful pat on the head, careful not to disrupt his harness before turning back toward the entrance. Clara will handle the communication with his legal team, Vance added as he walked toward the door. Get some rest, Miss Lynn. The hard part is over. Now we just wait for them to start bargaining. Clara stayed behind for another hour, helping me carry my 2 suitcases back up to apartment 4B. The hallway was quiet. The carpet Arthur had complained about looking exactly the same as it always did. When we stepped inside, the apartment was exactly as I had left it. Boxes stacked high, walls bare, the remnants of a life I thought I was being forced to abandon. Leave the boxes for now, Clara said, leaning against the kitchen counter. Just unpack what you need for tonight. I have to get back to the office to help review the preliminary discovery documents, but I'll call you the second their lawyers make contact. Clara, how much is this going to cost? I asked quietly, the reality of the situation beginning to settle in. A firm like yours, I can't afford this, even if we win the fees. Maya, look at me, Clara said firmly. We took this case on contingency. That means you don't pay us a single dime out of your pocket. We take a percentage of the settlement we get from Arthur. And believe me, Arthur is going to pay for every single minute of our time. We made sure to include our maximum billable hours in the statutory damages claim. You don't owe us anything. Arthur is paying for your defense. She hugged me tightly before she left, promising to keep me updated. When the door clicked shut for the second time that day, the silence of the apartment felt different. It didn't feel heavy or terrifying anymore. It felt like a shield. I walked over to the living room window and looked down at the street below. The city was moving along just as it always did. Cars honking, delivery drivers rushing by, people walking their dogs on the sidewalk across the street. None of them knew that a quiet war had just been fought in the lobby of the gray brick building behind them. I sat down on the floor next to the half-packed box of books. Scout came over, turning in 2 slow circles before dropping his heavy body right across my lap, his chin resting on my knee. We stayed, I whispered into the quiet room, running my fingers through his fur. We actually stayed. The next 48 hours were a strange, surreal waiting game. I didn't see Arthur. I didn't see the building manager. When I went down to the lobby to take Scout out for his morning walk, the dried brown stain of the spilled coffee had been meticulously scrubbed from the marble tile, leaving no trace of the confrontation. On Thursday afternoon, my phone rang. It was Clara. Get ready, Maya. Her voice was bright, filled with a sharp, professional energy. Arthur's legal counsel just reached out. They aren't even trying to fight the validity of the lawsuit. They want a formal settlement meeting tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock at their offices downtown. Are you going? I asked. We are all going, Clara said. Mr. Vance wants you there in person. He says he wants Arthur to look at the woman he tried to throw onto the street while he signs the check. The conference room on the 26th floor of the downtown high-rise did not feel like a place where compromises were made. It felt like a stage designed to make people feel small. A massive sheet of polished gray stone served as the table, surrounded by high-backed black leather chairs that absorbed the ambient sound of the room. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city looked like a miniature toy set, its chaotic traffic reduced to a silent, distant crawl. David Vance sat perfectly still, his hands clasped loosely over the top of his closed leather briefcase. Clara sat to his right, a neat stack of indexed folders aligned precisely with the edge of the stone table. I sat next to her, wearing the only professional blouse I owned, my hands folded tightly in my lap to hide the slight tremor that still visited my fingers when I thought about the previous Tuesday. Scout lay under the table, his large golden body resting directly across my sneakers. He was completely invisible to the other side of the room, but the solid, warm weight of him against my feet acted like an anchor, keeping me from drifting into panic. Across from us sat Arthur Pendleton and his attorney, a man named Marcus Vance, no relation to David, though the two older men acknowledged each other with a cold, formal nod that suggested years of mutual dislike in the city's legal circles. Arthur looked miserable. The gray suit was gone, replaced by a dark blue one that looked slightly looser on him, as if he had lost weight over the last 3 days. He didn't have his clipboard, his gold signet ring, or his swagger. He sat with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes fixed firmly on the polished gray stone of the table, refusing to look across the divide. "Let's skip the preamble, David," Marcus Vance said, opening a single, thin folder in front of him. "My client recognizes that the notice issued on Monday was procedurally flawed. It was an emotional reaction to a perceived property management issue, and it does not reflect the standard operating procedures of Pendleton Residential Holdings." "Flawed," Clara said, her voice sharp and clear in the quiet room. "Mr. Vance, your client didn't commit a procedural error. He violated federal civil rights law. He signed a document explicitly stating he was evicting a tenant because of a medical service animal, threatened her with law enforcement removal within 24 hours, and did so without a shred of due process. Let's call it what it is, an illegal eviction." Marcus Vance didn't flinch. He simply shifted his gaze from Clara to David Vance. "We are prepared to offer a full withdrawal of the eviction notice, a formal written apology from the management company, and a waiver of Miss Lynn's rent for the remainder of her current lease term, which I believe has 11 months remaining. We feel this more than compensates for the inconvenience." David Vance let out a low, dry chuckle that carried no warmth whatsoever. He didn't open his briefcase. He didn't look at the paperwork Marcus was sliding across the table. "Marcus," David said softly, leaning forward, "do you take me for an amateur, or do you simply think your client's money makes this problem small? 11 months of rent in a mid-tier apartment building is roughly $22,000. The federal lawsuit we filed on Tuesday morning is currently sitting on the docket of a judge who spent 5 years with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. If we go to trial, the statutory damages alone under the Fair Housing Act will dwarf that figure before lunch on the first day." "The court backlog in this district is 18 months, David," Marcus replied, his voice hardening. "Your client will be tied up in litigation for 2 years before she sees a single dollar. We are offering an immediate resolution." "My client is currently living in her apartment under the protection of a federal injunction," David countered, his voice entirely unbothered. "She isn't going anywhere. We are perfectly content to wait 18 months. Your client, however, has 2 major commercial refinancing deals closing at the end of this quarter, correct? I wonder how the underwriters at the bank will feel when they perform their routine background check and discover a pending federal civil rights lawsuit against the parent holding company for housing discrimination against a disabled citizen." The silence that followed was absolute. Arthur Pendleton's head snapped up. He looked at his attorney, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of purple. The corporate vulnerability was a detail he clearly hadn't expected the silver-haired lawyer to know. Marcus Vance's eyes narrowed slightly, the first sign that the blow had landed exactly where it was intended. "What do you want, David?" Marcus asked flatly. David Vance finally opened his briefcase with those 2 sharp, familiar brass clicks. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the stone table. It didn't have pages of legal jargon. It just had 4 lines of text and a final number at the bottom. "First," David said, ticking the points off on his fingers, "a comprehensive mutual lease termination, effective immediately at Miss Lynn's discretion. She will not spend another month living in a building managed by a man who thinks she is a liability." Arthur let out a small, bitter grunt, but said nothing. "Second," David continued, "the full return of her security deposit with interest within 24 hours. Third, a binding non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreement signed by Mr. Pendleton personally. ensuring he never utters my client's name or the name of her service animal to another landlord or rental agency in this state. "And the financial settlement?" Marcus asked, looking down at the number on the paper. "The number at the bottom of that page represents our calculation of statutory treble damages for intentional discrimination and emotional distress, plus our firm's accrued legal fees," David said. "It is $350,000, paid via certified check within 5 business days." Arthur leaned forward, his hands slamming down flat against the stone table. $350,000? For a dog? You're out of your mind. I didn't even touch her things. She's still in the apartment. You didn't touch her things because my legal team stood in your lobby and stopped you, Mr. Pendleton, I said. The words came out before I could think about them, breaking the unwritten rule that clients should let their lawyers do the talking. The room went completely still. Arthur glared at me, his eyes filled with the same cold fury I had seen on my porch on Monday afternoon. But this time I didn't look down. I didn't feel my blood pressure drop. Under the table, Scout gave my foot a firm, reassuring nudge. "You told me you own the brick, the mortar, and the air I breathed," I said, my voice steady, sounding stronger than I ever thought it could. "You told me you could do whatever you wanted because it was your property, but you don't own the law. And you don't get to treat people like they don't exist, just because you think they can't afford to fight you." Arthur stared at me, his mouth twisting into a tight, thin line. He looked like he wanted to yell, to storm out of the room, to remind everyone in the high-rise just how much money he had. But he looked at David Vance, who was watching him with the calm, predatory focus of an apex auditor, and then he looked at his own attorney. Marcus Vance looked at the paper, then looked at his client. He gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The message was clear: sign it, or it gets worse. Arthur's shoulders slumped. The anger seemed to drain out of him all at once, leaving behind only the cold, hard reality of a businessman who had made a catastrophic financial calculation. "Draw up the paperwork," Marcus Vance said quietly, closing his folder. "We will have the certified check delivered to your offices by Wednesday afternoon." The signing took less than 15 minutes. A series of initialed pages, a final heavy signature from Arthur that looked like an angry scrawl, and then the folders were closed. David Vance stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "A pleasure doing business with you, Marcus. Mr. Pendleton, I suggest you invest in a tenant relations seminar before you issue your next notice." Arthur didn't answer. He was already out of his chair, walking toward the side exit of the conference room without looking back, his legal counsel trailing a few steps behind him. We took the elevator down to the lobby in silence. When the doors opened into the bustling, noisy ground floor atrium, Clara turned to me and grabbed both my hands, a massive, uncontained grin breaking across her face. $350,000, Maya, she whispered, her voice shaking with excitement. "Even after our contingency fee, you're looking at enough money to put a down payment on a real condo. A place where nobody can ever tell you what kind of animal you're allowed to have." I looked down at Scout, who was sitting patiently by my side, his tail wagging softly as he watched the crowd of people moving through the lobby. He didn't know about the federal lawsuit. He didn't know about the stone table or the $350,000. He only knew that we were walking together, that my heart was beating in a slow, steady rhythm, and that the man who had tried to make us small was gone. "Thank you," I said to David Vance, who was checking his watch. "You earned it, Miss Lynn," the old lawyer said, giving me a warm nod. "You stood your ground. That's the hardest part of the law. The paperwork is easy. The courage is the variable we can't control." He walked out into the city, his heavy leather briefcase catching the afternoon light. Clara and I walked down the street toward a small cafe on the corner. The air was crisp, the sky a clear, brilliant blue. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel like a tenant trying to avoid making noise in a building that didn't want me. I felt solid. We sat at an outdoor table, Scout curling up under the metal chair, his chin resting comfortably on the concrete sidewalk. When the waiter came by, he didn't look at the harness with suspicion. He just smiled, set down a small bowl of water next to my chair, and asked what I wanted to order. I looked at the menu, then at my friend, and let out a long, quiet breath. "I think I'll start with a coffee," I said.